Well, the Sheik, like locally, he was famous. Everybody talks about him, about him being someone who is, like was a legend. And the thing with him was that he had so much success that people looked at his wealth, like the opulence of their house that they built in Williamston, and the way that he was willing to have big, huge gatherings. A lot of times they would local kids could come to the house and see the pool and see the wrestling ring out back, and he was welcoming to people and real but yet never broke character. He demanded that they called him the Sheik and not Ed or Eddie. Um, but his fame in wrestling was that he was just so far ahead of everyone else as far as hardcore wrestling is concerned, like with the ability to create chaos and make the fans be afraid of his character to the point where they would run away from him, or they would try to actually interfere in matches when the match was going on. Like there's a clip I saw recently of his manager trying to interfere in the match while he's using an illegal weapon to cut a guy's forehead open. And a fan from the crowd just comes running up on the ring apron and tries to take the guy down. And immediately the security from the arena came, of course, to get the guy. But that was the thing, is he could drum up so much of what they call heat in the wrestling industry, like the fuel, the animosity of the fans, that they kind of crossed the line of believing in what was happening was real. And like as soon as he would leave the ring, which he would do often, and enter into the crowd would scatter because they were actually sort of had bought into what was happening, so they believed that they might be in danger. There's a match I saw with him and Mark Lewin, who's someone he had lots of matches with, where I couldn't believe the way the crowd was just scattering everywhere he went. Like I can't imagine that power, because a lot of other wrestlers talk about being afraid about once the match is over, how would you get out of the arena safely, and they'd often have to get police assistance or whatever. But the story with the Sheik was that he'd go right marching towards the people and not run away from it, and they would end up like being afraid of him, and he would get out of there. But the great thing about him, and from my perspective, I recently listened to Brian Solomon's book, and the thing that is interesting to me is I think that like his being from Lansing and growing up in the automobile industry, and his ability to be part of that sort of that diaspora, that work, people who come from other places and come to America and they came to Michigan to work in the factories, how they were able to reinvent themselves. I think that helped him in wrestling to see that. And then I also think that his his Catholic background allowed him to be more able he had faith in who he was, and knew where he was coming from in life, so he was more able to get into his characters, which, obviously clearly from what you hear about his personality, he was a friendly man, but yeah, his characters were completely crazy. And as time went on, when he realized the more he turned up the volume on the craziness, the better it was for him in the business. He really exploited that outsider crazy part of who he was. The Sheik was able to purchase the big time wrestling territory, and there was only one other minority owner of a territory at that time that was involved with booking a territory, and it was like in the old territory system throughout the country that was called the National Wrestling Alliance. And each area had people who were the bookers, and they had control of that region, but they would also have like a cooperative where they would swap talent. So like if Andre the Giant was in one territory and another territory needed to drum up business, or the Sheik for that matter, they would call those people in from wherever they were at and trade talent temporarily to try to help that other territory was flagging, because they were part of that larger cooperative. But the Sheik, with his being Middle Eastern, and then a guy from Buffalo who was Mexican, those were the only minority people who were in charge of a territory in the NWA at that time. So that was kind of a big deal too, because, and they said that the other people involved in the NWA sort of looked down on the Sheik because the Sheik enjoyed going to Vegas and gambling and having some drinks, and he had an opulent home and was like to have the finest clothes and was interested in buying suits and things like that. And they thought that they kind of used that against him as like that he was somehow lesser than them because he didn't have the discipline to be more conservative. Most of the major people he worked extensively with, he became friends with. Like Leap and Larry Shane and he were very good friends. And Leap and Larry Shane was popular in Michigan, but he also traveled all over the country, just like all wrestlers did. And they were about, when Sheik was taking over Big Time Wrestling, they were about to have a big run of matches with he and Leap and Larry Shane. But unfortunately, Leap and Larry Shane got in a car wreck and passed away before that could happen. But that may have been his biggest opportunity to have a huge success. And he was a huge success, but he may have been the biggest thing in professional wrestling at that point because Shane was so popular too, and it hadn't spread to national success quite yet. But part of the Sheik's story, whenever you hear his story, the people like Abdullah the Butcher, who he had a long rivalry with, was someone he was friends with, and Bobo Brazil, who they were had a long rivalry. They were very close friends, and Bobo probably wouldn't have got the same chances elsewhere as an African American. I mean, they still at that time, African American wrestlers very rarely held belts, and he put the U.S. Championship belt for Big Time Wrestling on Bobo multiple times. So and that was a big deal that and they said that the Sheik had like a natural affinity towards social justice because he grew up in an area here in Lansing where there was a diverse range of people he grew up with. It wasn't just, he lived in a section that would have been a lot of Middle Eastern families, but it was also near where Martin Luther King would have lived, where there was African American neighborhoods over there by Main Street. Anyways, he was someone who, even though like his persona was such a dark, angry character, he seemed to have a sense of, behind the scenes of real decency and real loyalty to people he worked with. But the most famous friendships that I know of would be with Larry Shane and Bobo Brazil in particular. I mean, the trademarks were definitely it started with just he had the prayer rug and the headgear, and his character then, he was more of like an oil sheik or something like that. But as time went on and his character became more, he used a lot, he wouldn't speak in egg languages, like he was speaking in like a pigeon language, and it was like he would make strange faces and look to the sky and point to the sky, and but then like he had like different ways that he would bring blades to the ring, to mostly blade himself, but they did blade other wrestlers too. But he would bring little pieces of razor blade and tape, and either be taped to his hands or he'd have it. But he also had he used a pencil quite often, and then his like the most famous thing was the throwing of the flames with the flash paper. And of course, whenever he used that, the other person he was with had to be able to sell that it was, that they actually really did get burned. I mean, obviously, when they did that, no one really got burned, but they have to be able to convince the crowd that it was actually an effective weapon. There's a thing called hardcore wrestling, which is like wrestling that's not rooted in the traditional mat wrestling at all, or any of the early forms of wrestling that happened in America that would be professional wrestling. The hardcore wrestling was, they don't follow the rules. They use weapons. They go inside the ring. They go outside of the ring. It's not so much dependent on pinfalls. It's on the matches sometimes just end in disqualification because they devolve into chaos. And that was the thing with him. Although he always made sure, because of his being in charge of his own territory, that he somehow came out on top. He won most of the time. He very rarely would would lose a match. The qualifications were a weapon to make sure he didn't lose. That 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 to ensure that he won. I'm fascinated by the early days of wrestling and the whole idea of they coming from carnivals and sideshows and that kind of thing. And I think he definitely is a connection from the sideshow, like the Wild Men of Borneo type thing, or that exotic way of presenting people that were others. That was part of that. But then he found a way to take that, like, sort of being an other and, like, not only weaponizing it, but also, like, scaring people into thinking what he maybe could become with resources and the opportunity that wrestling gave him. I think that that's an interesting thing because, like, we live in a world now where we're familiar with most everybody from every cultural background, but that was still a time when people weren't familiar with so much about how other people live. So, like, you can make people who are exotic or different seem way scarier than you can now. And I think that's one thing that it would have been harder to be the Sheik now than it was in the past because people are way more aware of people from all over the world. I never saw him, like, when he passed. Channel 53 Studios had wrestling in there for a while, and his sons were running it out of there, and then because they were trying to carry on that tradition or whatever, and they filmed matches in there before. They were trying to book local shows in there, and at first it started out and it did pretty well, but over time, wrestling's just not the same. People don't, they don't support something that's small and local so much. They want the big, the big TVs and the huge arena type stuff. And he in particular was so good at working crowd psychology. I mean, I was trying to think of the best way to say how he managed it, but he was able to like when you see film of that time, he really did scare the crap out of people. No, he was not a big guy, and he wasn't like he worked out and was super, huge bodybuilder type person. He's just a little guy with a turban and like using chaos. I think it's cool that he was able to accomplish that. Just coming from there to here, didn't know. His family is a huge family. Didn't know what was gonna happen. His dad worked at Lansing Foundry. Was that like a drop forge or? Which Lansing was obviously the drop forge town, but yeah, my grandpa worked at Melling, and he showed me that as a kid. I think to try to say you don't want to do this.